everyone. Suzy and I are back with you. And this time we're talking about animal mysteries. And in both countries, in New Zealand and Australia, we have a lot of strange animal reports, don't we, Suzy?
Yes, we certainly do. More so in your country because we're a country of mainly birds.
Yes, the birds, yes. Yep. And I have to say, actually, before we sort of get into this, I wanted to make a point that Australia is, it's 7.5 square million kilometres as opposed to New Zealand. I don't know how big it is.
Tiny by comparison.
And in comparison, the USA is 9 million square kilometres. So Australia is a really big country. And the population of Australia is over 85% of it lives within 50 kilometres of the coast, of any coastline, right? So there's a whole lot of Australia that people aren't in all the time. It's quite sparse. So we have some strange animals in Australia. Ordinarily, we've got, we've got koalas, we've got kangaroos, we've got platypus, echidnas, wombats, the supposedly extinct Tasmanian tiger. I mean, we have some really strange animals. What sort of strange animals do you have?
Well, we actually don't have many strange animals at all because originally, before the early settlers came to New Zealand, the Maori lived here, of course, with the indigenous people. And apart from a few pigs and rats that had come on board their canoes from the islands, there were only birds. And so in New Zealand at the moment, apart from zoo animals, we just have domestic animals, really. Some cattle and deer, pigs are in the wild, of course, and, are hunted, but we don't have any of the weird and wonderful animals that you have in Australia, despite the fact that we're not actually that far away from you. And just to put the population in perspective, our population is not yet, for our entire country, the population of your largest city of Sydney.
Oh, really?
So not only do we not have many animals, we don't have many people either.
So when people say, "Oh, I'd like to see the countryside of New Zealand,"
that's what they see.
Yeah, well, it's not that much. It's not that far to go to see it, but. Yes. In Australia, I host overseas visitors, as you know, and people come here and from America and they say, "Oh, I'd like to go and see the outback." And I say, "Well, I'll just book you a bus ticket and see you in 3 days." But anyway, yes. So certainly both countries, but particularly Australia, but they're lands of mystery. And we certainly have our fair share of strange animals and unidentified enigmatic beasts. So I know here in Australia, we get a lot of reports of large cats. And I know you do too, Suzy. So why don't you give us and you've had your own experiences, so why don't you give us a bit of insight on that?
I have. Well, to start with, there have been quite a few sightings of like a mountain lion creature, which, of course, the skeptics said was probably a large cat, but the people who saw it said, well, it was an Arnold Schwarzenegger-sized cat then because it was enormous and looked like a mountain lion. But we have, in Canterbury over the last 10 years, which Canterbury's in the South Island, there have been sightings of Black Panther, and people claim to have photographed it. There have been some photographs on the net, and there's been articles and documentaries done about it in New Zealand, interviewing the witnesses. They found paw prints, etc., which were made into a mould. And it was interesting the other day that I saw on the internet, and we actually had one of the American scientists, astrophysicists, talking about it on our television the other night. The fact that they now think that there are multiple universes and that sometimes these universes crash or interact or overlap, and that's when we get some of these cryptid sightings and unusual things happening on our planet. And certainly that sort of is the case for me, because some years ago I was sitting in my living room and I turned to look out the window. It was a windy, fine, sunny day, and I got the shock of my life because striding across my front lawn was, to all intents and purposes, a black panther. Now, in those split seconds that I was watching it striding across my front lawn, maybe 15 feet from my ranch sliders, I could see its shoulders, the way its shoulder bones rose and fell as it moved. I could see the muscles rippling, and it turned its head and looked me directly in the eye. And that was a riveting experience. And I can remember thinking at the time, thank goodness my little corgi dog is inside and not out. But of course, it wasn't real, if you want to put it that way. And I watched it disappear. So just imagine that there's a hole in the air, is the only way I can describe it, or a slit. And as it moved towards it, it just disappeared and was gone through that hole in the air, if you want to put it that way. It was quite a shocking experience, and so when I heard this news about how we can have these other realities that may be interacting and colliding with our current reality, and to hear scientists actually saying this, that really made me sit up and think, well, perhaps that's what that incident was an example of.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it reminds me of a close encounter report that we investigated here about 2 years ago. And just south of Brisbane, where a woman had seen a large UFO in the trees on her property, and her dogs had gone bounding out across the paddock, and they disappeared as they were bounding for about 30 or 40 metres, and then they came out the other side. They reappeared.
Very similar. Yeah, very similar.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, so that was quite an experience. But we do have other cryptids. There have been sightings of moose, which we don't have in New Zealand, but hunters in the back blocks of very remote areas of the South Island have reported seeing moose. Also moa, which is a now extinct bird that was very large, flightless, about the size of an emu or bigger. And there have been, current day sightings of that in remote areas of the South Island. It's supposed to have been extinct for hundreds of years, over 100 years. Otters is the other thing that have been seen in New Zealand, which are not a native to New Zealand, and we're a long way from any country that has otters. So, and also the kokako, which is a beautiful bird that's been extinct for a long time. And there's been sightings of that as well. So who knows, maybe there are pockets of that exist somewhere, and people are adamant that they've seen it, but the naysayers say, well, it was just another one of our very melodic birds singing, but it has quite a distinct sound, but it is now extinct.
Oh, very interesting. I've not actually seen a large cat or any sort of large out of place animal, but I do love to dig around in newspaper clippings. So I've found a few that actually date back. One dates back to 1933, and it appeared in the Cairns Post on the 16th of December. And it was a report made to the Chief Inspector of the Fisheries and Game Department of a large animal resembling a tiger or jaguar that was seen in the Gippsland area in Victoria. And its footprints were 6 inches long and 4 inches wide, but with a stride of 4 feet, which isn't unusual for if it is a large cat. In one place, the animal had jumped 9 feet across a gully. And there were 2 girls also who saw the animal's head and shoulders, and they described it as tawny with dark stripes, so a bit like a tiger sort of thing. Yeah.
Interesting. And of course, in New Zealand, the skeptics people who are skeptical will always say, well, it's an escaped circus animal or zoo animal or something like that. But let's face it, we've only got a handful of zoos in New Zealand. We're a tiny country, and I'm sure they'd know if one of their occupants was missing.
You would hope, wouldn't you? Yes. Hello, we've lost a large tiger or a large lion. Oh my gosh, no, that'd be a bit frightening to put out. But on that point though, Suzy, also while I was digging around in the archives here, I found an article in the Bendigo Advertiser. It was dated the 15th of November 1906. And but it was Bostock and Wombwell's, I'll get it right yet, circus and menagerie, and they were sold off. There was another report in 1913 to the Western Mail in Perth, and it was Bud Atkinson's circus that was closed. And apparently they'd had really bad weather the month before, and they thought that really contributed a lot to it. But what happened was they sold all the lots of the circus off, including the animals, and the people involved in the circus, they returned to America. But my question is, how come we're really only seeing big cats? And I mean, some of those animals probably just died because the environment wasn't suited to them. But where are the rest of them? And they had like a collection, a worldwide collection of animals in these circuses. So where are the rest?
That's a good point. Why aren't we reporting giraffes and elephants? So
yes, exactly.
It's always big cats. Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, do you have any other sort of big cat reports or?
No, just mainly the Black Panther one and the small spate of reports of the tawny-looking mountain lion.
Oh, okay.
Variety. Yeah.
Yeah.
But there have been ongoing in New Zealand, and mainly reports by people who should know what they're talking about. Experienced hunters or farmers or whatever, who are used to seeing livestock and used to seeing animals and domesticated animals. So you would think that they would know what they were looking at.
Exactly, and that's what I found digging through these old newspaper clippings, that the people who report them are people on the land, so they would be very familiar with what they see in the bush, or you would expect that they would. Yeah,
that's right. So it does make us lean towards something that's coming in and out of our reality. Otherwise, we don't have reports of people being gored to death by a big cat or anything like that, just the sightings of them, and then they kind of disappear or melt into the landscape. So it remains mystery.
Right. So do you have reports over there of things like Bigfoot or yowies, what we call them here?
Yeah, not generally, but we do have some report or mythology around Maori mythology of such a creature, which I think we'll cover in a separate episode, but not your classic Bigfoot or yowie sightings such as you would have in Australia.
Okay, because there's quite a few here. One was actually only in 2000. I mean, there's a lot, because there's quite a few Facebook pages and websites that cover this. But there was one report that I came across just only in April 2016, and it was from a man from Wonga Beach who reported seeing something big and really hairy with an oblong-shaped head. And that was while he was driving home from work on the Rocky Point Range. But that actually occurred in 2014. And he described the creature as standing upright, and its arms were hanging behind it as it ran. And I found that a really common feature in a lot of these reports. It's very strange.
Gangly arms dragging along behind, yes.
Yes. And another report was from an anonymous man at Port Douglas in North Queensland, which is, for those who don't know, is up near Cairns Way. And that was relayed to the Cairns Post again in 2013. And there were two men who were fishing at Mowbray, which is about 7 kilometres south of Port Douglas. It was about 2 a.m. It was all quiet when suddenly they heard a noise like they had never heard in their lives. And I've got a little story to tell you about that. Like a growl, but not like any animal that they knew. And it freaked them out. And the man, they were so disturbed that the man who was reporting this, he went to cut his fishing line, but actually cut his fishing rod in half instead. He must have been really disturbed to do that. How bizarre.
Yeah.
But anyway, he managed to start the ute before his friend had even moved. He was that freaked out. He just wanted to get out of there. And they reversed out as quickly as they could, and they had the spotlight on, and suddenly the creature was on the bridge ahead of them going really fast. And they described it as having dark brown hair, coarse and thick like a dog's hair, and its arms were flying behind it once again. It was really strange.
Yes, well, that certainly would give you the willies, wouldn't it?
Yeah. some years ago, I received a couple of reports actually from local people. One was from, it was a woman who had seen a family of yowies, 2 adults and a young one. Now, I think she said it was near a lake or some sort of, a water reservoir or something like that near Mount Gambier, down in, oh gosh, where is that? South Victoria? I should know that. I'm Australian. But anyway, wherever it is, I think it's down there. And I said, and she described it to me, and very much, she was some distance away, but she could see there were 2 adults and 1 young, and the young one was actually at the water's edge, sort of playing in the water, and the 2 adults were standing some ways back, just observing, watching, what was going on in the area. She remained silent in the bushland, and then they just disappeared. She wouldn't give me the exact location because she said they're just living quietly, don't want anyone going there, disturbing them, basically. And then there was another report, probably about the early 2000s, of a man who called me. He was driving from Brisbane to the Gold Coast on the highway there in the early hours of the morning. It was still pitch black though, and he said he saw this huge, hairy, ape-like creature just loping over across the highway at that time, and it just sort of went across in front of him, in front of the headlights, and then he just kept on driving. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was very strange. And then last year, my partner in crime, paranormal crime, Barry Taylor, and I, we were down house sitting for friends in the Border Ranges, and they were going away, and we wanted to go down for a while because they'd seen UFOs in the area too, which is another interesting connection. And anyway, so they're near, they could look out towards Kyogle, I think it was, in Woodenbong, and the valley just fell down, from the mountains from where they were, and just fell down. You could see for miles and miles and miles. And we were there just watching the skies. This is daylight, mind you, watching the sky. And we heard this sound it was something I'd never heard before. And you could tell it was traveling from, a long miles and miles, at least 4 miles, we thought. Miles, I'm talking, not kilometres. And it was like a howl and a whoop and it was like a young whatever it was. It was very, very strange. And we were filming at the time. We hoped that we caught it on the sound on the film, but it didn't come out very clearly. So, but it's interesting how there's often those types of reports of Bigfoot around UFO reports as well.
Right.
Yeah.
It must be something in our psyche, Sheryl, the human psyche, that makes us, gives us a fascination, but also a healthy fear of such things. I remember the little road trip that you and Barry and I did several years ago up northern Queensland coast. And we were travelling, for the listeners' benefit, we were travelling quite late at night. I'd been speaking at a meeting and you guys had driven me there. And on the way home, we took a wrong turn and we were going up through very winding, very thick trees and bush, coming down close to the road. And Barry was driving and I was in the back seat, you were in the front, and suddenly Barry just quietly said, "You realise this is Yowie country." And at that point in time, this fear raced up my spine, and then the panic in the car, or the atmosphere in the car, became quite palpable. You could have cut it with a knife. And the best way that the three of us dealt with it was to start laughing after a while. But that fear was still underlying all the laughter. Let's get out of here as fast as we can and find the right road.
Yeah, there was a very strong feeling.
A very strong feeling of being watched, but then that's the kind of feeling we get when we're faced with darkness and the unknown, etc. But we all reported that very strong feeling.
Well, it was an incredibly dark night, a narrow road, a windy road going up a hill. Actually, we were going towards Montville at the time, and it was and it was like a single lane, and it was just a very strange atmosphere.
Black, one of the blackest nights I've ever known. And the interesting thing is, just as a little aside here, is that many UFO witnesses who've had an experience at night, particularly if they're outside of a vehicle or whatever and in the open and have seen a UFO, will report that just before they see it, the night became blacker, became darker, and rain stopped and birds stopped singing. So yeah, very interesting.
Isn't it though? How strange.
But something else you said there, you talked about the sound that one of the yowies had made. And we've got a Maori myth to do with a creature called the Paua Kai. And this had such a spine-tingling, blood-curdling sound. It was a bird. And it was reputed to be black and white with a massive wingspan and red crest. And it was so big, it was able to pick up humans and take them away to be consumed, presumably. Now, for a long time, this blood-curdling bird was part of mythology, but of course now they have discovered that the Haast eagle, which is now extinct and has been extinct for a long time, the remains that they found, it was a massive bird with a massive wingspan. It was so big that it could pick up a moa, which is our big flightless bird the size of an emu. And that's pretty large. It could pick it up with ease and carry it off. So there may be now, they believe, some truth in the myth that it could easily have carried off children or small adults. So, and the blood-curdling sound that it made was really the only warning before it descended upon you.
Wow, that's bizarre.
It is.
It is. It's almost as bizarre as I'm about to tell you too, because
okay.
Because there you know the Indigenous Australian people here, they also have things in their mythology or in their stories. I don't want to even call it mythology really, because but this one was probably the most bizarre. I've read quite a few, but this is the most bizarre. It was of a giant predatory reptile that roamed the bush of Australia and roams the bush of Australia. It had done so for millennia and been part of the Australian Indigenous people's law and was known as the Burrinjaw, which is really unusual. It was said to be a large bipedal reptile of some sort that can reach sizes of up to 25 feet high and seems very much like the common image of a Tyrannosaurus rex today, which is really interesting because there's been reports of flying reptiles in Papua New Guinea too. So it's quite stout. It has powerful hind legs and small arms and said to inhabit various parts of Australia, such as Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory of Australia, as well as parts of northern Queensland. And remember, we're talking about really remote areas in Australia.
Yeah.
And one notable sighting was made in 1957 near the MacArthur River, when around 50 cattle began to panic for no discernible reason. And the attending station owners couldn't figure out what was going on. And another owner reportedly went running and screaming by in the distance towards a nearby river. And at that moment, there was reported a booming, loud, grunting noise, and there was reported the sight of a tall shadow streaking off in the distance. So, and after this incident, several dead, mutilated cattle were found with their corpses brutally mauled and half-eaten as if by a large crocodile. Makes you wonder, doesn't it?
Becoming a more scary place by the minute for me.
Well, Australia is a very strange place, that's for sure.
Yeah, but it's interesting though, isn't it, the how some of the mythologies were not quite made up stories. Some of the Maori mythology was made up, was eventuated to explain an event or explain something to perhaps younger children, but they're now finding, of course, that some of the creatures may well have actually existed. So that's very interesting. And then, of course, moving from the cryptids and the mythology, we have spirit animals, of course, that a great many people see. You know, just in conversation with people, people will report seeing their cat that died 5 years ago still sitting on their bed or whatever. So I've certainly had quite a few experiences of that kind. How about you, Sheryl?
I haven't, but I did have an experience when I was teaching someone Reiki, which I've done in the past. I did that from about 1997 to about, I don't know, 2010 or something. And at that time, there's something in Reiki, which is a hands-on healing modality called an attunement. So you're drawing particular symbols in the auric field of someone sitting in front of you. But while I was doing that, I did see, actually, no, I did, with these sort of experiences, the feeling that something is there is so strong that somehow it translates into an image in your mind. And I was very aware of this person's a little dog sitting there, and I described the dog to them later, and he said, "Oh, that was my little dog. I died about 6 months ago." So that's probably the only. There was another case but it wasn't me. It was where I was actually doing a hands-on healing session for someone, where they felt like an invisible cat was walking up and down their torso. Yeah, so that was very interesting.
It can be very comforting for people to know, or have someone tell them that there's a spirit animal there, and be able to identify it as a pet that they've had, that they've been worrying what happened to it and where is it now and is it okay. It can be very comforting for people, just as it can talking about a loved one, a human being who's passed on. I remember when I was a child, because I've always seen spirit people but also spirit animals and been able to communicate with animals, and I remember saying to my mother that I could see this small white dog following her around the kitchen. Just on one or two occasions I would see a fleeting glimpse of it, and it was a very wiry little terrier. The first time I told her about it, she went a bit white and she went off and rummaged through a photo box and came back with a photo of her brother when he was about 10 or 11, and he was leaning over patting exactly the dog that I had seen, and it was their little wire-haired white terrier that they'd had as children. So we do know that they're still around and following us. I have a corgi dog, and quite often both my husband and I have seen a very old female corgi, a slightly different colouring, but we don't know whether it's our little corgi's mother or what it is, but we actually have two corgis wandering around our house, not one. And she comes along just when you least expect it. And many times I have caught a glimpse of her out of my peripheral vision and have thought that it's my dog approaching me. And when I have turned my head, of course, it just disappears and there's no dog there at all. I'm catching a glimpse of this little old female. But people can also dream of the spirits or souls of animals that later manifest in their life. And that also happened to me some years ago. My elderly dog, we'd had to put her down because she was very ill. And I remember my mother asking me, "Are you going to get another dog for the kids?" And I said, "No, not just yet. Don't feel ready for one yet." And then one day I woke up and I'd had this dream, and in the dream I was somewhere where there were kennels and mesh fences like chicken wire, and leaning against the chicken wire was this very small fluffy dog with gingery coloured caramel ginger hair poking through the wires of the chicken wire fence, looking at me. And I woke up and remembered it, filed it away, didn't think much more about it. And several weeks later, when I was visiting my mother, she said, "Oh, let's take the kids to the SPCA and see if there are any puppies available." And I wasn't that keen because I just didn't feel ready for it. But we went anyway. And they said, "No, we haven't got a lot of puppies at the moment. We've just got one out the back." And of course, you can guess what I'm going to say. We went out the back, and there's the chicken wire fence, and there's the little caramel ginger fluffy dog puppy sitting there with its hair poking through the fence looking at me. And I had already told the lady that I would not want a big dog. And I said, "Well, take it." And she was very surprised and said, "But you said you didn't want a big dog, and this is an Alsatian cross, so it is going to be quite big." I said, "No, we'll take it." I've already met her. And the woman looked at me strangely because she didn't know what I was talking about, but that she proved to be the most amazing little dog for my sons to have and grow up with them. And so I felt like she had somehow or other connected with me or selected me or whatever as her owner some weeks before we actually met. And a lot of people report that kind of thing.
Yes, I remember when you were here recently in Brisbane staying with us a couple of weeks ago, I was cat sitting my daughter's cat, and she'd just dropped her off, and she was over to you, you know, quite happy to see you and be around you, whereas other people, everybody else, she has not wanted to be near them, you know, like, no, thank you, I don't want any part of it. Like, so some people have a real affinity to some animals, like that strong connection.
Yes, I think I always have had right from a child. I used to, when I was very little, I had a white cocker spaniel, and I used to talk to her at night when I went to bed. I would say good night to her telepathically because it seemed quite natural and normal for me to do that, and I would wait. And within seconds or so, I would get what I believed was a reply for her. And it wasn't instantaneous, so I would wait, and I would know when I'd got that rush of love and affection from her, which I knew was a response. So it was just a natural thing for me as a kid to be able to see other people's deceased pets and tell them about it or whatever. And one day, some years ago, I was visiting a friend of mine, and as I walked along the hallway with her, I glanced into one of her bedrooms and just without thinking said, "Oh, there's a grey tabby cat curled up on the end of the bed." And she stopped dead and said, "Funny you should say that, because I had an elderly lady visit me recently who said she was psychic, and she walked down the hall with me and said, 'You've got a grey tabby cat curled up on the bed.'" So obviously we'd both seen the same cat that was, you know, had decided to make that bedroom its home, a spirit cat, of course. So yes, we have these things that happen. And then, of course, go on.
Oh, no, go on.
In terms of animal communication, we now know, scientists are saying that octopi also have feelings, that fish have feelings, that they are sentient beings. And I think this is contributing more and more to our understanding of our companion species on the planet, and possibly to the big switch to veganism, which isn't just about better ecology or animal husbandry or whatever. It's also about understanding that creatures have feelings. And I can remember driving up to the city of Auckland once some years ago, and I've written about this in my book, and I had this feeling that I was being called and that a creature was in distress. It was extremely unhappy, and I followed that call, and that I knew exactly when to stop. And I stopped at a cafe in the middle of a gorge. Now, it wasn't just to have a coffee, it was because, strangely, that's where this feeling or this call was coming from. And I went inside, everything looked quite normal, walked around, trying to hone in on that feeling, and came across a very small aquarium with a rather large eel in it, and not much else, a few pebbles in the bottom. And I knew immediately that was the distress call. This creature was extremely distressed in this dreadful environment. And I spoke to the lady who ran the cafe, who wasn't particularly keen on taking any notice of what I was saying. So I called the SPCA, and they said, "Well, we don't deal with fish and eels and things like that. We just deal with, farm animals, cats and dogs, etc." But they said that they would call in and talk to the proprietor anyway, and just perhaps use their status as SPCA to be able to make a change. And so they did that, and the next time I went in there, the aquarium was now very large with all sorts of plants and structures and things in it, so that the eel could actually hide. It really needed to be released, but at the very least it had been provided with a much better environment. So there are a lot of people who have these sixth sense about animals and can communicate with them and pick up their feelings, pick up what's wrong with them, and communicate with them in a variety of ways.
Well, spirit animals can also manifest as our totem animals, because I teach shamanic journeying to people, and during those journeys, I actually take people into journeys so they can find their power animals. And the interesting thing is when they find their power animals, that the qualities of those animals they particularly relate to in a lot of ways. And the qualities of the animals can also point them in the direction of things that they need to improve or be aware of in their life. And it always amazes me, and even in my own experience while I've been drumming while people are having these journeys, the last particular experience was where I was overpowered by a lion, a male lion, and it was a very strange experience, but these things happen, and I wonder what the connection is between humans and the animal kingdom, and whether we're sort of connecting through the ethers in ways even more than what you're describing, but like connecting to that particular groups of animals. What do you think?
Well, I know that in my contact experiences, I have been told by the ETs that we do not yet understand how the emotional aspect of animals, their emotions and their compassion and feelings, we do not yet understand that, and we do not yet understand how important that is and how that interacts and interlaces with our own, and how their existence is so important to our survival. And they described the etheric soup, the emotional soup that we live in, and how a balance is necessary. So it's a great thing that we're beginning to understand how animals operate and how they can communicate with us, and more people are feeling that empathy towards animals, and it's being recognised by governments and by institutions, etc. For example, even though it's not animals, in New Zealand we recognise a river as having a status in the same way that human beings do. So we now, I think, have 2 rivers which have that kind of status of respect and sentience. So we're talking about the life of the water and the life of the environment the water flows through. So these are the underlying, what would you call it? Underlying themes, underlying emotions, underlying understandings that are going to move us forward in our own evolution, and hopefully help us to understand ourselves and our place in the world and in nature better.
Well, in Australia, in the crypto world, there's a bit of talk, actually all around in Western world anyway. There is talk of yowies, for example, communicating telepathically with some individuals. And I think you had received some sort of stories about them over in the United States when you were there, didn't you?
Yes, I stayed in New Hampshire with a researcher and a scientist, and when I was going to bed one night, I was in the 3rd story of their farmhouse, way up high, and the curtain was open, and it was a very wilderness area. So there was a stretch of land going down at the back of their house to a small stream, a few logs, and then it was straight into the forest. And I had this strange feeling as I stood up there that something was not attaching to me, but connecting with me. And it was the most extraordinary feeling, because it wasn't the kind of feeling I might get from a spirit contact or an ET contact. It was just something altogether different. It was quite overwhelming and overpowering, and I felt quite transfixed by it, and it unnerved me a bit. So I pulled the curtains shut and I didn't turn the light on, and I got into bed in the dark and felt like something was reaching into my mind, reading everything about me, but it had a good feeling, even though it was unnerving. It was underlying a good feeling. So the next morning when I went down to breakfast, I was sitting speaking to my host, and I told him I had this strange experience last night, and I could even pinpoint the exact point on the edge of the forest where this feeling, strong feeling of connection was coming from. And he was eating his porridge, and he got his spoon to here, and he stopped and he looked at me and he held his hand like that, listening to what I said. And when I'd finished, he said, "That was Bigfoot." I said, "What?" And he proceeded to tell me how on a number of occasions he and all of his neighbours had seen Bigfoot in the forest there. And he said that one in particular would come to the edge of the forest where there was a fallen log, and exactly the spot that I described, and I even took him outside and pointed to where it was. He said he has seen it come to the edge of the forest, stand there, watch him when he's out in amongst his vegetable garden, and then it would just blend into the forest and be gone. He said they would come out at night, they would take the apples, etc. Sometimes they would throw things on the roof of the house just to be noticed. They would hear the sound of them calling. And on one occasion, when he'd been into the forest to meditate by a stream, he said he was just about to walk out into the clearing where the stream was, and he saw one of them bending over on its hands and knees in the water trying to tickle trout. And it must have heard him. He said it threw its head up, and as it threw its head up, its long hair swished up and down its back with all the water spraying from it, and it got up the bank on the other side and melted into the forest. So, this is a scientist, a researcher, also an engineer, and you have to sit up and take notice of people who live in these quite remote environments and witness these kinds of things that are also witnessed by their neighbours. And he told me that there was an old brown bear that would come down the valley. It wasn't really capable of feeding itself anymore, and that he was aware that that the Bigfoot were actually looking after it and leaving food out for it, etc. So very, very interesting stories from the people in that area, quite riveting in fact. And as I said, I didn't see anything visually, but I really sensed something that was extraordinarily different from anything I've ever experienced before.
Yeah, amazing, amazing. Some years ago, and I probably have to say at least 20 years ago, I was going to a UFO meeting because I wanted to hear a woman speak. She was an Aboriginal woman talking about yowies. And she was from the Woodinbong area, I think, as well, and which is an area that is known for yowie reports, okay? And she was saying that the people she knew and her herself, they had experiences where in houses where the humans are living and they have children, that the yowies are quite interested in them. And one particular case, she said, was where they were inside. I think it was a cool night. They're sort of hovering around the heater or the fireplace, and up against the window was a yowie, and it was just doing this, rubbing its hand very gently on the glass, looking at the children playing, and going ooh, ooh, like that. Almost like it was trying to communicate with them. Non-aggressive, very calm, and but very almost communing with the people inside and the children inside. So I thought that was a very interesting.
Yeah, very nice account. Yeah.
Yeah. So, do you have any more? Have you had any other personal experiences in the strange world of animal mysteries?
Yes, I have. But the personal accounts, I can tell you a personal account. Same thing as what I experienced with the eel. On one occasion, I experienced, when I was driving home from the city of Tauranga out to where I live, I had this feeling once again of something calling me. It was a really lonely feeling. There was terrible loneliness and anxiety and illness and pain and solitude. So I followed it. I knew I had to turn off on a particular road. I could feel it there. and I traced it to a property where I found a dog that was chained up on a very heavy chain. It didn't have a proper warm kennel. It was a chicken coop with the wind howling through it. Its water bowl was all slimy. There was no food around. And after a little bit of tracking down, I found that the owners were away and they had left it there alone on an orchard, and a relative was coming in once a day and feeding it. It clearly hadn't been exercised for a long time. It was a big dog. It was an Afghan, which should have been in beautiful condition, silky and gorgeous. It was extremely matted. It had Demodex mites all around its eyes. It was bald on its face. Its eyes were running with pus. It was very old and crippled, and that was the dog that was calling to me for help. So I had a bit of a fight with the relative, and said I was taking it to a vet. So I did. I took it to the vet. The vet wanted to prosecute, said it was one of the worst cases of neglect that they had seen. That the dog was elderly. It could undergo treatment for the mites and the mange and the illnesses, but it was already elderly and in a lot of pain, and probably, you know, the treatment would be a long time, would be grueling. And it was better to put it down. So I gained permission through the relative to put the dog down. So I took it home with me for one night of freedom and being able to run around the paddock and play. And next day I took it back to be put down, and it was in the back of my vehicle, which is where they gave it the injection. And as it went, it just kind of slowly sagged down and into the boot of the car, and the whole way down, its eyes looked into mine, all the way down until it put its head down and closed its eyes. And I drove back out to the property where someone was going to help me bury it, dig a hole, dig a grave and bury it. And on the way out, in my sixth sense, or my mind's eye, if you like to call it that, I saw the spirit of that animal rise up out of its body in the back of my car, and it was standing with its head between the two front seats where I was driving. It looked younger, it looked beautiful, it pricked up its ears, it looked out to one side of the car, and it surprised me. It gave this enormous leap out the side door, and for a few seconds I could see it running alongside the car, which was only going slowly up a hill at that stage, running alongside the car, and then it just vanished. So I knew that its spirit was free of pain and disease, and was gone and was happy. So we took its overcoat, its very sad and matted body, and buried it, and I planted flowers on top of the grave and made it look nice. And so, you know, animals are capable of calling out to us if they find a matching human mind that can pick up that call. And I just happened to be on my way home and hear that lonely cry.
Oh, amazing. It is interesting how maybe all life forms can call out to each other in times of duress. I know that certainly humans do that. They can seem to communicate outside of themselves, outside of their body, in those times of duress.
Yes, I do recall visiting an elderly lady in hospital who was in a coma, and that night I woke up with quite a shock because something was touching my arm, and she was standing by the bed, and she was thanking me very much for having sat with her while she was in her coma. And the next day she passed away, but she'd left her body at night just for that little visit and say thank you. So yeah, we're digressing from animals here, aren't we?
That's okay, we're allowed. But on my end, I'd like to wind up with one more crypto story, which I've just discovered recently, which happened in late July and early August in 2005. And the reason why this one was significant was because it involved 4 RAAF, Royal Australian Air Force personnel, who were, they were located around 26 kilometres east of the town of Weipa on the western side of Cape York Peninsula in Queensland. And they were engaged in a series of exercises and drills codenamed Northern Awakening and Kakadu. And it was during this time that a band of this band of 4 Air Force members, they came across something rather strange out in the wilderness. And there was one other unidentified individual too. So we're out with the tracking dog, doing manoeuvres to intercept a mock special forces team as part of the exercises. And as they crept along a creek line, a bizarre quadrupedal, I don't know, I keep stumbling over it, quadrupedal creature standing about waist high with spotted fur, a small head, and reported as moving like a cat. And it ambled out of the brush as they entered a clearing, startling the dog in the process. And they said it was sniffing on the ground where they'd just come through. He stopped about 50 metres away and just remained there sniffing and watching them, because they're there watching through their night vision scopes, you know. And they described it as the 2 front legs were bigger than the 2 back legs, with big shoulder blades, and to them it looked like a hyena, which is interesting. I'm casting my mind back to those circus animals, but anyway. It's unclear what happened next, but following their sighting, they found a paw print pressed into the mud, and it was spotted again 2 nights later. And when it was reported to come to within 10 metres of an observation post, and it lurked about for a time before disappearing. And a night vision image was taken of the creature, but it was too hard to tell what it was, except that it was bizarre, and they described it as almost demonic looking. So that's a little bit spooky.
Yes. Oh, well, I can't have an Aussie upstage me with a last one, Sheryl. I'll have to have a last one now.
Go on.
In New Zealand, Maori describe a taniwha. Taniwha can take the form of a dragon, which is interesting, a dragon in New Zealand, and it can take the form of a whale or a shark, etc. And these the mythological creatures are generally associated with water, and they can be, beneficial to mankind. They can help you out, be a guardian in those water conditions, or they can take you away and take you down into their lair. So there are some places, well, many places in New Zealand where historically there's a mythological taniwha that lives in a particular place, in a particular river, and that holds a lot of credibility in New Zealand, because we understand that some of those places are actually dangerous places in that river. So perhaps children are being told taniwha there, don't go in there, and so therefore the children are protected from the dangers that lurk in that area of the river with eddies or incoming tides or whatever. But they have a personality. Many of them have individual names, and so it's a thing that is held in great respect in New Zealand, because it has this guardianship kind of aspect to it. So yeah, there you are.
Interesting.
Last mythological creature for the day.
Well, there's so much more to talk about in animal mystery, so we'll have to come back and do an animal mysteries too, I think, because we really just scratched the surface of this topic. Yeah.
Okay, well, we've done our dash today.
We have. So thanks for joining me, Suzy, and
Sheryl.
Thanks everyone. I hope you enjoyed this, and we will be back again very soon. Bye for now.
Bye for now.